Hello dear students, today we will discuss a measure of dispersion which is used in biostatistics. It is called as range. So what is meant by a measure of dispersion? When we have a set of observations or when we have a data, we usually check the measure of central tendency. For example, we check the mean, but by simply checking or by simply computing the measure of central tendency, we won't be able to get an idea of how the individual observations in the data are, or how are they close to the mean value, or how are they far from the mean value. So that property is called as variance. So this variability, suppose you have two sets of data and both of them have the same mean or average value, but still they need not be of the same variability. The observations need not be of the same variability. So for that we are going to the next measure, which is called as the measure of dispersion. It shows how an observation is, how much the individual observations differ from the average. That is called as measure of dispersion, and one of the measures of dispersion is range. Range is the difference between the highest value and the lowest value of the data. So what is it used for? More than using it as a measure of dispersion, we are using it to know the spread of the data. So here you can see this is the maximum value and this is the minimum value. The difference between these two is the range. The process of finding range includes three steps. First one is you arrange the data in either ascending order or descending order, then identify the lowest and highest values of the data, find the difference between the lowest and the highest data point. This will give you the range, and here is an example. We have such observations in which they are already arranged in the ascending order, and you can see the highest value is 35 and the lowest value is 2. So what is range? It is highest value minus lowest value is equal to 33. 35 minus 2 is equal to 33. Now we will go to some more problems. You are to find the range of the first 40 multiples of 3. So we have to write the multiples of 3, the first 40 multiples starting from 3, then 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24 like that, and the 40th multiple is 120. So which is the lowest value? 3. The highest value 120. So range is equal to highest value minus lowest value is equal to 120 minus 3 is equal to 117. Now you have another data, the marks scored by students in the class, and the marks are given here. They are already arranged in the ascending order. If you are given the data without an order, you have to first arrange it in the ascending or descending order, then find out the highest value, that is 97 here, the lowest value 3 here, and the range is equal to highest score minus lowest score, that is 97 minus 3 is equal to 94. Earlier we saw data for such individual observations. Now we will see how we calculate the range for a continuous frequency distribution. For a continuous frequency distribution, range is calculated as the difference between the lower limit of the minimum interval and upper limit of the maximum interval in a grouped data. So suppose you have some class intervals here, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30 and 40 to 50. The range is calculated as the difference between the lower limit of the minimum interval and the upper limit of the maximum interval. So here you have 4 classes, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is the minimum interval, and which is the lowest limit, it is 0, and this is the maximum interval. What is its upper limit? 40. So range is calculated as 40 minus 0 is equal to 40. So this is how we find the range for grouped data. And range is also useful to find the class interval. That means the width of the class interval can also be found if you know the range. That is, class interval, the width of the class interval is equal to range by number of classes. So, we just take the above example. We want to know the width of the class interval. You are given the range. As suppose you already know the range as 40 and know the number of classes as 4, then you can determine the class interval, the width of the class interval. How? 40 by 4 is equal to 0, 10. 40 by 4 is equal to 10. So, the width of each class interval is 10, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, like that. So, if you have range and the number of classes, you can determine the width of the class interval. There is a relationship between the range and standard deviation, which is stated by the range rule of thumb. It suggests that most values would be in the area covered by 4 standard deviations. That is, plus 1 standard deviation, plus 2 standard deviation. Likewise, there will be a minus 1 standard deviation and minus 2 standard deviation. That means, within 2 standard deviations above the mean, plus 1 and plus 2, and within 2 standard deviations below the mean, minus 1 and minus 2. So, most of the values would be in this area, and this allows us to define the unusual values. That means, if there are any values outside, as those which do not fall into this range. So, we call the maximum usual value the mean plus 2 standard deviations, this one, and the minimum usual value the mean minus 2 standard deviations. So, this is how we arbitrarily consider the maximum usual value and the minimum usual value. Those outside are the ones which do not fall into this range. So, here you can see usually the range of a data lies within 4 standard deviations. That means, 2 standard deviations above the mean and 2 standard deviations below the mean. This is what is called as the range rule of thumb. Why it is mentioned here? We will go to one problem which we discussed earlier, that is this one. You can see the marks scored by students of a class is from 3, 4, 42, 47 up to 97, you can see. But there are some values which are less than the earlier mentioned values, that is the maximum usual value and the minimum usual value. So, when we compute, we can understand that 3 and 4 are below the minimum usual value and 97 is above the maximum usual value. What is maximum usual value? Mean plus 2 standard deviations. What is minimum usual value? Mean minus 2 standard deviations. So, 3, 4 and 97, they are out of this range. So, usually when we calculate range, we just omit these values which are above the maximum usual value and which are below the minimum usual value. So, that is, for this purpose we apply the thumb rule. So, this is what the range rule of thumb says. The range rule of thumb suggests that most values would be in the area covered by 4 standard deviations, which will allow us to define unusual values which do not fall into the range. Now, we go to the uses and limitations of range. There are more limitations than uses. That is why limitations are mentioned first. There are some drawbacks. First is, the range will not tell us the number of data points. It does not give any idea about the number of observations. It cannot be used to find mean, median or mode. The range is affected by extreme values or outliers. What do you mean by outliers? Those which are above the maximum usual value and those which are below the minimum usual value. They are called outliers. The range cannot be calculated for open-ended distribution. What is an open-ended distribution? Distributions which begin or end like less than 57 or greater than 100. So, in such classes, you do not have fixed value. So, in that case, you cannot calculate range. Why? Because range is equal to the highest value minus lowest value, and if the highest class is like greater than 100, or if the lowest class is like less than 57, you won't get a value to calculate. So, range cannot be used for open-ended distributions. So, these are the limitations, and what are the advantages or merits? The simplest computation, you can calculate it very easily. It will help us to know the spread and size of the data, how much it is spread. It helps to identify if the given data point is within the defined range or not. That means we will be able to know whether a particular data is an outlier. Also, for a given end data point of the data, we can find the other end data point with the help of range. That means you are given the highest value and the range. Then you will be able to know the lowest value, because highest value minus lowest value is equal to range. So, if you know the range and if you know the highest value, then you can calculate the if you know the range and if you know the highest value, then you will be able to calculate the lowest value. So, this is all about range.